Imagine standing at the very edge of the known world. Not metaphorically, literally. You are a Roman soldier, dusty from weeks of marching, and behind you lies everything civilization has ever built. The forums of Rome, the libraries of Alexandria, the marble temples of Athens. In front of you is a river so wide it looks like a sea, and beyond that river, nothing. Absolutely nothing. The ocean stretches west into a void that your maps simply leave blank. Ancient geographers called this place the end of the earth. The locals believed that just past the river's mouth, the sun fell screaming into the water every evening, hissing and steaming as it died. Roman soldiers, hardened men who had seen the deserts of Africa and the frozen forests of Germania, reportedly refused to march further west, not because of enemies, because of fear. Pure, superstitious, bone-deep terror of what lay beyond. And yet, right here, on these 7 hills above this terrifying river, someone had already been living for over 1,000 years before the first Roman sandal ever touched the soil. That someone knew something Rome did not, and it would take Julius Caesar himself, the most dangerous mind in the ancient world, to figure out exactly what it was. The story of Lisbon is not the story historians usually tell. It is not a gentle tale of trade and culture slowly blossoming on a sunny riverbank. It is a story of blood, stubbornness, economic warfare, mythological obsession, and one of the most cynically brilliant political decisions in the entire history of the Roman Empire. To understand what Caesar did here, and why, you first need to understand what this place was before he arrived. And to understand that, you need to go back. Not a few centuries, a few millennia. Long before Rome existed, long before Greece had written down a single line of Homer, before Carthage had launched a single warship, people were already living on the hills above the Tagus River. The Tagus, the longest river in the Iberian Peninsula at over 1,000 kilometers, pours into the Atlantic through one of the largest estuaries in all of Europe. The locals had a name for this enormous inland stretch of water where the river widens before meeting the sea of straw, Mar da Paglia. Even today, standing at its edge, you understand why. On a clear day, with the sun at a certain angle, the surface of the water turns golden, shimmering like a field of wheat stretching to the horizon. It is extraordinary. And 3,000 years ago, before the city existed, it must have been overwhelming. The earliest inhabitants of the region were pre-Celtic Iberian peoples, tribes whose names history barely preserved, whose languages left almost no written trace. Archaeologists classify them loosely as part of the broader Atlantic Bronze Age culture. They were not primitive. They built fortified hilltop settlements, engaged in long-distance maritime trade, and constructed collective tombs cut directly from living rock. Extraordinary structures that still survive today in the hills around what is now Greater Lisbon, at places like Palmela, Cascais, and Alla Praia near Estoril. These are not small curiosities. Some of these megalithic tombs are genuinely impressive architectural achievements, evidence of a society with surplus labor, organized religion, and a concept of collective identity strong enough to invest enormous effort in caring for its dead. On the hill of Serra de Monsanto, on the northern edge of what would become Lisbon, there is evidence of human habitation dating back to approximately 2000 BCE. That is 4,000 years ago. The city of Rome, to put this in perspective, would not be founded for another 1,200 years. The Romans, when they finally arrived and started asking questions, collected local traditions and recorded them with their characteristic mix of genuine curiosity and imperial condescension. They found stories about a people called the Oestrimni, in Latin, literally, the people of the far west. Ancient Greek and Roman sources describe them as inhabiting a vast territory stretching from what is now Galicia in northern Spain, all the way down to the Algarve in the south. They were maritime traders, moving goods along the Atlantic coast in boats made of hide stretched over wooden frames, a technology that astonished the more sophisticated Mediterranean observers who encountered it. These were not isolated backwoodsmen. They were connected to a web of Atlantic trade routes that stretched north to Britain and Brittany, exchanging metals, furs, amber, and salt with communities across hundreds of miles of coastline. Then the Celts arrived. The Celtic migration into the Iberian Peninsula began in the first millennium BCE, waves of Indo-European peoples pushing westward from Central Europe, bringing with them iron technology, a new set of languages, and an aggressive expansionist culture. They did not simply displace the existing population. Over generations, they intermarried with the native pre-Indo-European peoples, creating hybrid cultures and new tribal identities. In the area around what would become Lisbon, this process produced tribes known as the Chempsi and the Cefes, the latter sometimes rendered as the Ophis, meaning people of the serpents, a name that carries its own mythology, its own darkness. The Celtic newcomers brought iron. They built more sophisticated fortifications. They continued and expanded the existing trade networks. The hill of what is now the Castelo de São Jorge, the hilltop fortress that still dominates the Lisbon skyline, was already a fortified settlement, what the Romans would later call an oppidum, a place where people lived, traded, and defended themselves against their neighbors. It was into this world, already ancient, already complex, already economically active, that the Phoenicians sailed sometime around 800 to 700 BCE. The Phoenicians are one of the most consequential civilizations in all of human history, and also one of the most underappreciated. Based in the cities of the Levant, modern-day Lebanon, they were the supreme maritime traders of the ancient Mediterranean world. They had already founded Carthage on the North African coast. They had established trading posts in Sicily, Sardinia, Malta, Cyprus, and the Balearic Islands. They had sailed through the Strait of Gibraltar, which the ancients called the Pillars of Hercules, the edge of the known world, and they had kept going. They wanted tin, which was essential for making bronze, and almost impossible to find in the Mediterranean. They wanted gold from Iberian river valleys. They wanted Atlantic fish, enormous quantities of it, processed into the intensely flavored sauce that the entire ancient Mediterranean world craved. And they wanted a safe harbor on the Atlantic coast, a place to rest, resupply, and trade before pushing further north toward Britain and Brittany. The mouth of the Tagus was perfect, sheltered, deep, enormous, large enough to anchor entire fleets. The surrounding hills were already inhabited by people who had things worth trading, and so the Phoenicians established a presence here. The name they gave the place, or the name that scholars believe they gave it, was Alis Ubbo, sometimes rendered as Alis Ubbo. In the Phoenician language, this translates roughly as pleasant bay, safe harbor, or calm cove. It is a practical name, a sailor's name, the kind of name you give a place not because of its history or its myths, but because of what it does for your ships. The evidence for Phoenician presence in ancient Lisbon is real, physical, and genuinely exciting. Excavations beneath the medieval Sé Cathedral, the oldest church in Lisbon, built directly on top of layers of earlier occupation, have uncovered Phoenician pottery, artifacts, and structural remains dating to the 8th century BCE. Further finds in the Alfama district and on the slopes of Castle Hill have confirmed a sustained Phoenician presence that lasted for centuries. But here is where it gets complicated and historically fascinating. Most modern archaeologists and historians are careful to distinguish between two different theories of what the Phoenicians actually did at Lisbon. The first theory is that they founded the city, that there was nothing significant here before they arrived, and that Ubbo was a Phoenician creation from the ground up. The second, now more widely accepted theory, is that the Phoenicians did not found the city so much as they attached themselves to an existing indigenous settlement and transformed it through trade. The Chempsy and Cephes were already there. The hilltop was already fortified. The trade networks already existed. What the Phoenicians brought was Mediterranean connectivity, the ability to plug this existing community into a much larger economic system. They were not conquerors or colonizers in the traditional sense. They were, as one scholar put it, commercial parasites in the most productive sense of the word. They arrived, traded, left things behind, built relationships, and moved on, transforming everything they touched without necessarily dominating it politically. This distinction matters because it changes how we understand what Olisipo, the name the settlement would acquire, almost certainly derived from or related to the Phoenician original, actually was. It was not a Phoenician city. It was an Iberian city with Phoenician connections, and those connections were extraordinarily valuable. Through the Phoenicians, the people of the Tagus estuary were linked to Carthage in North Africa, to the Greek colonies in southern France and Spain, to the great trading cities of the eastern Mediterranean. Luxury goods flowed in, metals, fish sauce, salt, and horses flowed out. The hilltop settlement grew, its economy diversified, its population increased, and its strategic importance, already significant because of the river and the harbor, became impossible to ignore. The Greeks, too, had an interest in this place. Ancient sources suggest that Greek traders, specifically Phocian Greeks from the city of Phocia in modern-day Turkey, may at one point have maintained a trading station at or near the mouth of the Tagus. They were eventually displaced as Carthaginian power in the western Mediterranean grew. Carthage, founded by Phoenician colonists from Tyre, gradually took control of western Mediterranean trade routes, and the Iberian Atlantic coast fell increasingly within its commercial and political sphere. This meant that Olisipo, by the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, was operating within a Carthaginian-dominated trading network. Carthaginian coins have been found at Iberian sites throughout the region. Carthaginian merchants were active in the peninsula, and when the great confrontation between Carthage and Rome finally came, the savage, world historical clash that we know as the Punic Wars, Olisipo found itself, almost by accident, at the center of one of the most consequential geopolitical struggles the ancient world had ever seen. The Second Punic War, which began in 218 BCE and lasted until 201 BCE, was arguably the closest the ancient world came to a genuinely global conflict. It stretched across the Mediterranean, into Spain, across the Alps, through Italy, and eventually to North Africa. The stakes were existential. One of the two great powers of the Mediterranean was going to be destroyed. On one side, Carthage, wealthy, commercially dominant, commanding an empire of trade routes and allied peoples stretching across North Africa and into Iberia. On the other, Rome, militarily aggressive, constitutionally obsessed with expansion, and increasingly convinced that no rival power could be permitted to exist. The Iberian Peninsula was crucial to both sides. For Carthage, it was a primary source of silver, manpower, and military supplies. For Rome, controlling Iberia meant cutting off Carthage's resources and eliminating a potential base for future attacks. The drama played out with almost cinematic intensity in the territory around what would become Lisbon. Mago, the younger brother of Hannibal himself, was stationed with his forces among the Cinetes and Conii tribes in the Algarve, the southernmost part of Portugal, just a few hundred kilometers from Olisipo. Hasdrubal Gisco, one of Carthage's most capable generals, was encamped at the mouth of the Tagus River, directly in the shadow of the hills above modern Lisbon. For a period of years, the strategic heartland of the future Portuguese nation was effectively a Carthaginian military zone, occupied by the forces of a North African empire in a war against Rome. The people of Olisipo would have seen Carthaginian soldiers, Carthaginian ships, Carthaginian administrative officials. They would have traded with Carthaginian merchants and paid whatever levies the occupying power demanded. Then, everything changed. In 206 BCE, the Roman general Scipio Africanus won the decisive Battle of Ilipa in southern Spain, shattering Carthaginian power in the Iberian Peninsula in a single afternoon. Hasdrubal Gisco fled. Mago evacuated his forces by sea. The Carthaginian presence in Iberia collapsed almost overnight. Roman forces moved rapidly westward, occupying former Carthaginian territories and establishing control over the peninsula's trade routes and silver mines. By 205 BCE, Roman armies had reached and occupied Olisipo. The transition was not entirely peaceful. The Lusitanian tribes of western Iberia were not interested in simply exchanging one foreign master for another. But the strategic calculation had been made. The far western corner of the known world now belonged to Rome. And Rome, initially, had no idea what to do with it. The early Roman presence in what would become Portugal was primarily military. The legions were there to pacify the local population, extract resources, and prevent any future rival from using the peninsula as a base. The Lusitanians, the dominant tribal confederation of the region, from whom the Roman province would eventually take its name, were not cooperative. They were fierce, mobile, and deeply resistant to Roman authority. They raided Roman supply lines. They ambushed Roman patrols. They refused to be absorbed. And in 155 BCE, they launched a full-scale revolt that would shake the Roman world and produce one of antiquity's most extraordinary military leaders, a man whose story intersects directly with the transformation of Olisipo, and whose ghost, in some sense, still haunts the history of Portugal. His name was Viriathus. Viriathus was not supposed to be a problem. He was, by Roman accounts, a shepherd, a herdsman from the hills of western Iberia, born into poverty, raised among goats and the wind-swept plateaus of what is now central Portugal. The Romans who first encountered him almost certainly dismissed him as irrelevant, one of thousands of rough provincial men who occasionally caused trouble before being crushed by the machinery of Roman military power. They were catastrophically wrong. What Viriathus turned out to be was something Rome had almost no experience dealing with. A genuinely brilliant guerrilla commander who understood, with what seems like almost modern strategic clarity, that you do not fight Rome on Rome's terms. You do not line up your infantry on a flat plain and let the legions grind you into dust. You disappear into the hills. You strike at night. You hit supply lines, not battle formations. You make the cost of occupation so high, so relentless, so psychologically exhausting, that even the most powerful military machine in the world starts asking whether the prize is worth the price. For 14 years, from roughly 147 BCE to 139 BCE, Viriathus ran rings around Roman armies. Not occasionally, consistently. He defeated Roman commanders who had previously won campaigns in other theaters. He humiliated generals who arrived in Iberia with full legions and left with shattered units and damaged reputations. At one point, he forced a Roman army into such a desperate position that its commander had to negotiate a treaty, an almost unheard-of concession for Rome, which considered itself constitutionally incapable of admitting defeat to a barbarian. The Roman Senate, deeply embarrassed, eventually repudiated the treaty. But the fact that it had been signed at all tells you everything about what Viriathus had achieved. He had made Rome blink. The city of Olisipo sat at the western edge of this conflict. The hills above the Tagus were Lusitanian territory, and the people who lived in the fortified settlement on what is now Castle Hill were caught between the grinding pressures of Roman military expansion and the turbulent politics of the tribal confederation that Viriathus led. Roman forces moved through the region. Decimus Junius Brutus Callaicus, the Roman consul sent to finally pacify the northwest of the peninsula, used Olisipo as a military base and supply point during his campaigns in 138 BCE, pushing north across rivers that his soldiers superstitiously feared to cross, fighting his way through territories where no Roman army had previously ventured. He fortified Olisipo. He built defensive walls against the possibility of Lusitanian raids. He transformed the settlement from a commercial outpost into something with genuine military infrastructure. And then, Viriathus died. Not in battle. Rome could not kill him in battle. He died in his sleep, stabbed by 3 of his own officers who had been bribed by a Roman commander named Servilius Caepio. The assassination was so nakedly corrupt, so obviously arranged, that when the 3 killers went to collect their promised reward, Caepio reportedly refused to pay them. When they complained, he is said to have replied that Rome does not pay the wages of those who murder their commanders. It is one of history's more spectacular acts of institutional hypocrisy. The 3 men received nothing. Viriathus was buried with full military honors by his own people. A funeral described in ancient sources as genuinely magnificent, with games and contests held in his memory. And then the resistance slowly collapsed. By 138 BCE, with Viriathus dead and his coalition fragmenting, Olisipo was fully integrated into the emerging Roman provincial structure. The city had survived the war. Now it had to figure out what it meant to be Roman. The answer, it turned out, involved fish. This requires some explanation, because to a modern reader the connection between fish sauce and geopolitical significance seems absurd. But in the ancient world, garum, the intensely flavored fermented fish sauce produced throughout the Roman Mediterranean, was not a condiment. It was an industry. It was a luxury good. It was the ancient equivalent of a substance that was simultaneously a cooking ingredient, a status symbol, a medicine, and an export commodity worth more per volume than most metals. Ancient Roman recipes use garum the way modern haute cuisine uses truffle or saffron, sparingly, expensively, with full awareness that you are deploying something rare and powerful. The best garum, produced from the finest fish with the most carefully controlled fermentation process, commanded prices that would be genuinely shocking by any modern standard. A small ceramic amphora of premium garum could cost more than a laborer earned in a month. The Tagus estuary was perfect for producing it. The river system flowing into the Sea of Straw was extraordinarily rich in fish, particularly the species most prized for garum production. The Atlantic waters off the Portuguese coast were cold, nutrient-rich, and teeming with marine life in quantities that Mediterranean fishermen could barely imagine. The local population had been processing fish for centuries before Rome arrived. The Phoenicians had recognized and exploited this resource, and the tradition of Atlantic fish processing was deeply embedded in the regional economy. What Rome brought was scale, industrial scale. The capacity to organize, systematize, and export fish products across an empire of 50 million people from one end of the known world to the other. Archaeologists working beneath the streets of modern Lisbon have found the physical evidence of this industry, and it is genuinely extraordinary. In the ancient Casa dos Bicos building on the edge of the Alfama district, a structure that still stands today in a later form, 4 large reservoirs were discovered that were almost certainly connected to a fish salting and processing installation. Similar facilities have been found on the south bank of the Tagus at Casillas. At Porto dos Cascos, near Alcochete, archaeologists uncovered evidence of a large-scale Roman fish processing area. The scale of these operations suggests that Roman Olisipo was not merely supplying local markets, it was exporting massively. The fish sauce and salted fish of the Tagus region were moving east along Roman trade routes, carried in those distinctive ceramic amphorae that archaeologists find on every Roman site from Britain to Syria. Salt was the other critical resource, and it is impossible to overstate how strategically important salt was in the ancient world. Before refrigeration, before chemical preservation, before any of the modern technologies we use to keep food from rotting, salt was the only reliable method of preserving protein for long-distance transport or long-term storage. Armies ran on salt. Navies ran on salt. The entire ancient economy of preserved food, without which long-distance trade, permanent cities, and military campaigns of any significant duration were simply impossible, ran on salt. The word salary comes from the Latin salarium, the salt ration or salt payment given to Roman soldiers. The phrase "worth his salt" preserves the same ancient reality. Salt was, in the most literal sense, money. The Tagus estuary produced salt in significant quantities. The tidal flats and shallow coastal areas around the river mouth were ideal for salt production by solar evaporation, a method requiring minimal technology, but producing large volumes of a product that was essential everywhere and produced efficiently only in certain geographic locations. Combined with the fish processing industry, the salt production of the Olisipo region gave the city an economic foundation that was genuinely difficult to replicate. You could not simply move the fish, you could not move the estuary. The geography that made this place valuable was permanent, and Rome, with its characteristic eye for economic advantage, recognized and exploited it ruthlessly. But it was the horses that made Olisipo legendary in a way that fish sauce and salt, however economically important, never quite could. The Lusitanian horse, bred on the Atlantic plains of western Iberia, shaped by millennia of a specific landscape and a specific culture of horsemanship, was famous throughout the ancient world. Not just well-regarded, famous, celebrated in literature. Praised by the best-informed natural historians of the age, Pliny the Elder, writing his encyclopedic Natural History in the 1st century CE, described the Lusitanian horses in terms of almost mystical admiration. Strabo, the Greek geographer who produced one of the most detailed accounts of Iberia ever written in antiquity, remarked on their speed, their agility, and their extraordinary quality. Ancient writers repeatedly connected these horses to a specific legend, that the mares of western Iberia were so exceptional because they were impregnated by the west wind, Zephyrus, turning their natural reproduction into something almost supernatural. This was not merely poetic fancy. It reflected a genuine ancient understanding that the horses of the Tagus region were different, physically distinct from the heavier cavalry horses of Central Europe and the Mediterranean East, faster and more maneuverable than the sturdy workhorses of northern Gaul. Modern horse historians have connected the Lusitanian horse directly to the contemporary Lusitano breed, which is still considered one of the finest riding horses in the world. In antiquity, these animals were prized for cavalry use, for the circus, and for the elaborate equestrian displays that wealthy Romans used to demonstrate their status and sophistication. Owning Lusitanian horses was a mark of taste. Racing them was a serious business, and the plains and river valleys around Olisipo were among the primary breeding grounds for a commodity that the richest people in the empire wanted desperately. It was into this context, an economically productive, strategically positioned, culturally complex city that had survived Phoenician contact, Carthaginian occupation, Roman conquest, and a decade and a half of Lusitanian warfare, that Julius Caesar arrived sometime around 61 BCE. Caesar was not yet the figure history remembers. He was not yet the dictator, not yet the conqueror of Gaul, not yet the man who would cross the Rubicon and end the Roman Republic. He was a quaestor, then a propraetor, a mid-level Roman official assigned to the province of Hispania Ulterior, the further Spain, that included the western territories of the Iberian Peninsula. He was also deeply in debt, politically ambitious to a degree that bordered on pathological, and in urgent need of military glory and financial resources to fund his future political career in Rome. Ancient sources, including Suetonius and Plutarch, preserve a story about Caesar's time in Spain that has become one of the most famous anecdotes in all of Roman biography. Standing in front of a statue of Alexander the Great in a temple in the Spanish city of Gades, modern Cadiz, Caesar reportedly burst into tears. When asked why, he said, "Do you not think it is a matter for sorrow that while Alexander, at my age, was already king of so many peoples, I have as yet achieved nothing memorable?" Caesar was 39 years old at the time. The story may be apocryphal, or at least embellished, but it captures something real about the man's psychology. His terrifying, consuming urgency. His inability to accept that greatness might come slowly, or might not come at all. He was in a hurry, and Western Iberia, with its restless tribes and its wealthy cities, offered opportunities that a man in a hurry could exploit. Caesar conducted military campaigns in the region, fighting against tribes that had not fully submitted to Roman authority and extracting significant plunder in the process. He was effective, ruthless, and fast, as he would be in everything he did for the rest of his life. But the military campaigns were, in a sense, secondary to the political and administrative decisions he made during this period, decisions that would shape the western edge of the Roman world for centuries. Among those decisions was his treatment of Olisipo. Exactly when Caesar granted the city its elevated status is a matter of some scholarly debate. Some sources attribute the formal grant of municipium status and the name Felicitas Julia to Caesar himself. Others suggest it may have been finalized under his heir Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. But the connection between Caesar and the transformation of Olisipo is consistent across ancient sources, and the logic of the decision is entirely consistent with Caesar's broader approach to provincial governance. The name alone is a statement of intent. Felicitas Julia Olisipo. The word felicitas in Latin means happiness, prosperity, good fortune. But in a Roman political context, it carries additional weight. It was a word associated with divine favor, with the blessing of the gods on a particular person or place. Caesar used variants of the word in his own political self-presentation, associating himself with the concept of Felix, the fortunate, the favored by fortune. To name a city Felicitas Julia was to stamp it with Caesar's personal brand, to associate it permanently with his name and his luck, to make it, in the most literal sense, his city. Julia, of course, was his family name, the gens Julia, the Julian clan, which claimed descent from Venus herself through the Trojan hero Aeneas. Every time anyone referred to Felicitas Julia Olisipo, they were invoking Caesar's family, Caesar's fortune, and Caesar's divine ancestry. It was an act of political branding so elegant, it has lasted 2,000 years. The status of municipium, which Olisipo received as part of this transformation, was not a bureaucratic technicality. It was one of the most consequential legal designations in the entire Roman system of governance, and understanding what it actually meant requires stepping back and looking at how Rome managed the enormous, culturally diverse, linguistically fragmented empire it had assembled through 2 centuries of relentless military expansion. Rome did not govern its empire the way modern nation-states govern their territories. There was no uniform administrative code applied identically from Britain to Syria, from the Rhine to the Sahara. Rome governed through a complex, layered system of relationships. Some cities were colonies, populated by Roman citizens transplanted from Italy. Some were allied communities with treaty relationships. Some were simply subject peoples who paid taxes and provided soldiers and received nothing in return. And then, at the top of the provincial hierarchy, were the municipia, communities granted the extraordinary privilege of Roman citizenship and self-governance, allowed to run their own affairs under their own elected magistrates, subject to Roman law, but possessing the legal standing that came with full integration into the Roman civic world. The right of Roman citizenship was not something Rome distributed casually. For most of the Republic's history, it was essentially restricted to people born in Italy. The Social War of 91 to 87 BCE had forced Rome to extend citizenship to the rest of the Italian peninsula, a traumatic political upheaval that nearly destroyed the Republic. But even after that convulsion, citizenship for people in the provinces remained the exception rather than the rule. When Caesar granted the people of Olisipo the Latin rights, the jus latii, a form of partial citizenship that was the standard first step toward full Roman civic status, and elevated the city to a municipium, he was doing something that the city's population of approximately 30,000 people would have understood immediately as extraordinary. They were no longer provincials. They were no longer subjects. They were, in the eyes of Roman law, participants in the Roman project. Their magistrates could become full Roman citizens. Their city could send representatives to interact with the Roman legal system on equal terms. And, crucially, practically, immediately, they were exempted from the tax burden that crushed most provincial communities. 30,000 people, tax-free, on the western edge of the known world. The economic implications were staggering. Provincial taxation in the Roman system was not gentle. The standard arrangements involved tribute payments, requisitions of grain and supplies for military forces, forced labor on public works, and various other extractions that could consume a significant fraction of a community's economic output. For a city like Olisipo, productive, commercially active, generating real wealth from fish, salt, and horses, the tax burden under normal provincial arrangements would have been substantial. Eliminating it did not merely leave more money in the hands of the local population. It fundamentally changed the city's competitive position relative to other communities in the region. Olisipo could invest in infrastructure. It could attract merchants and craftsmen who preferred a tax-advantaged location. It could fund public buildings, the theaters, bathhouses, temples, and forums that were the visible markers of Roman urban civilization, without the crushing overhead that made such investments impossible for most provincial cities. The physical transformation of Olisipo under Roman rule was remarkable. The city that Caesar and his successors built on those 7 hills above the Tagus was genuinely impressive by the standards of any era. The hill of what is now the Castello de São Jorge, already the site of the ancient oppidum, the fortified settlement that had existed since before the Phoenicians arrived, became the Roman Acropolis, the elevated center of administrative and military power. From there, the city spread down the hillsides and into the valley below, following the natural topography of the 7 hills in a pattern that would define Lisbon's urban geography for the next 2,000 years. Roman urban planners laid out streets on a grid system where the terrain allowed it, cutting through existing organic patterns of settlement with the characteristic Roman preference for straight lines and right angles. They built a forum, the central civic space surrounded by temples, administrative buildings, and markets that was the heart of every Roman city. They built a theater, whose remains are still visible today in the heart of the Alfama district, preserved beneath the streets of the oldest surviving neighborhood in the city. They built thermal baths, the elaborate bathing complexes that were simultaneously hygienic infrastructure, social spaces, and demonstrations of Roman engineering confidence. They built an aqueduct to bring fresh water from the surrounding hills into the city, because a Roman municipium without a reliable water supply was simply not a proper Roman municipium. The roads were perhaps the most consequential element of all. Roman roads were not merely transportation infrastructure, they were the nervous system of the empire, the physical expression of Roman power across space, the mechanism by which goods, soldiers, information, and ideas moved from one end of the known world to the other. From Olisipo, Roman roads ran north along the Atlantic coast toward what is now Porto, and beyond into Galicia. They ran east toward the provincial capital of Emerita Augusta, modern-day Mérida in Spain, which was the administrative center of the province of Lusitania, and the city to which Olisipo was constitutionally connected. They ran south toward the Algarve and the other coastal cities of the province. These were not dirt tracks or rough paths. They were engineered surfaces, layers of gravel, sand, and large flat stones, carefully graded for drainage, sometimes paved with large cut stones in urban areas, marked with milestones at regular intervals showing distances to major cities. Traveling from Olisipo to Emerita Augusta on a Roman road, you knew exactly how far you had come and how far you had to go. The empire was measured, organized, mapped, and labeled in a way that no previous civilization in this part of the world had ever achieved. And along those roads moved the product that made Olisipo worth all of Caesar's political investment. The garum went east in ceramic amphorae sealed with clay stoppers, stacked in the holds of riverboats and then transferred to ox carts for the overland journey. The salt went with it, and with the salted fish, enormous quantities of preserved protein that could travel hundreds of miles without spoiling, and that fed Roman soldiers on campaign, Roman workers in the mines and quarries of the interior, Roman urban populations in cities that could not produce their own food. The horses went north and east on their own legs, driven by Lusitanian horse handlers along the Roman road network toward the cavalry depots and the racing circuits and the great estates of wealthy Romans who wanted to demonstrate their sophistication by owning the finest animals the Western Empire could produce. The trade was not only outbound. What came back to Olisipo along those same roads was equally significant, and it transformed the city's material culture in ways that archaeology has documented in extraordinary detail. Fine pottery from workshops in Italy and southern Gaul, glass vessels from workshops in the eastern Mediterranean, coins minted in Rome and in the provincial capitals, circulating through a monetary economy that replaced the older barter and gift exchange systems that had governed economic life in pre-Roman Iberia. Wine in amphorae from Spain, Italy, and North Africa, olive oil from Andalusia and North Africa, used for cooking, lighting, and the elaborate ritual of the Roman bathhouse. Bronze figurines of Roman gods and goddesses, gradually replacing or supplementing the older Lusitanian deities, Uricus, Carneus, Bandiar Bariacus, whose names survive in inscriptions found at sites throughout the region, evidence of a religious world that Roman culture absorbed rather than immediately destroyed. This process of cultural absorption, what historians call Romanization, was neither simple nor complete nor uniform. The people of Olisipo did not wake up one morning and decide to become Roman. The process took generations. The elite families of the city adopted Roman names, Roman dress, Roman legal customs, and Roman religious practices first, because doing so gave them access to the privileges and opportunities that Roman civic status provided. Ordinary people followed more slowly, more selectively, maintaining older traditions and languages and practices, even as Roman material culture penetrated every aspect of daily life. Lusitanian religious practices continued. The old language left traces that survived long after Latin became dominant. The cuisine retained local ingredients and local techniques, even as Roman cooking methods and imported Roman products entered the kitchen. It was not conquest in the sense of annihilation. It was something more complex and more interesting. A negotiated transformation in which both sides changed, in which the Roman Empire was itself shaped by the peoples it absorbed, even as it reshaped them. The province of Lusitania, of which Olisipo was one of the most important cities, developed a distinctive regional identity within the Roman world. It was Roman, certainly, Latin-speaking, law-governed, urbanized, connected to the imperial trade network. But it was Roman in a specifically Western Iberian way, shaped by the Atlantic landscape, the extraordinary productivity of the Tagus estuary, the tradition of maritime trade that went back to the Phoenicians and beyond, and the stubborn independence of the Lusitanian people, who had made Rome work so hard for so long to establish control. The city that Julius Caesar had named Felicitas Julia, the fortunate, the blessed, justified that name with a durability and prosperity that outlasted the man who gave it. What happened next was not gentle. The Roman Empire did not collapse quickly or cleanly. It frayed over centuries, attacked from outside and rotted from within, its western half gradually fragmenting into a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms that preserved some Roman institutions while destroying others. The first waves arrived in the early 5th century. Alans, Vandals, Suebi, the Germanic peoples who had been pressing on Rome's northern frontiers for generations, and who now poured through the breached defenses. In 419 CE, the Visigothic king Wallia plundered and burned Olisipo, the city that had been Felicitas Julia, the fortunate city, the blessed city, reduced to ash and ruin by a barbarian army that Rome could no longer stop. In 468, Remismund conquered it again, this time with the help of a Hispano-Roman collaborator named Lucidius. The Suebi held it, then lost it, then fought over it again. The Visigoths eventually established control over most of the Iberian Peninsula and held it for 2 centuries. But their control was never entirely secure. Their culture never fully displaced the Roman foundation beneath it, and their political structures were chronically unstable. And then, in 711 CE, everything changed again. The Islamic forces that had swept across North Africa in one of history's most extraordinary military expansions crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and began moving north through the Iberian Peninsula with terrifying speed. Within a few years, they controlled most of the peninsula. Olisipo, which had by now evolved through several centuries of linguistic drift into something closer to Ulishbuna in the Arabic phonetic system, became a Muslim city. For brief moments, it was even an independent Muslim kingdom, the Taifa of Lisbon, from 1022 to 1034, before being absorbed into larger Islamic political structures. The Moorish presence in the city lasted for over 4 centuries, and it left marks that are still visible today, in the layout of the El Fama district, in the Arabic-derived place names scattered throughout the region, in the word El Fama itself, derived from the Arabic al-Hama, meaning the baths, a reminder that the thermal infrastructure the Romans had built was still functioning, still central to urban life, centuries after the last Roman magistrate had left the building. The city that Julius Caesar had transformed with a political decision, the stroke of a bureaucratic pen that gave 30,000 people on the edge of the world the rights and privileges of Roman citizenship, had survived everything. Phoenician traders, Celtic migrations, Carthaginian occupation, Roman conquest, Lusitanian rebellion, Visigothic invasion, Islamic rule. Each civilization had added layers to the palimpsest of the city. Each had built on and over and through what came before. and the result was a place of extraordinary historical depth. A city where, if you dig down far enough beneath the streets, you find not just one past, but a dozen, stacked on top of each other like geological strata, each layer preserving evidence of a world that no longer exists except in the ground beneath your feet. The Roman theater that Caesar's successors built on the hillside below the Castello di São Jorge was rediscovered in 1798 during construction work and has been partially excavated. You can visit it today. The fish salting tanks beneath the streets of the old city have been incorporated into a museum display in the Rua dos Correieiros. You walk above them on a glass floor, looking down at the Roman industrial infrastructure of 2,000 years ago, still perfectly legible in stone. The cathedral, the Se, sits on top of the Phoenician and Roman layers, a medieval building constructed over the ruins of a mosque that was itself built over a Roman temple precinct. The hill of the Castello de São Jorge still dominates the skyline, exactly as it dominated the skyline when Celtic tribesmen first built their oppidum there 3,000 years ago. The geography has not changed. The river is still there, still pouring into the Atlantic, still one of the great natural harbors of the European coastline. What Caesar understood, and what the Phoenicians understood before him, and what the Celtic tribes understood before them, and what the Neolithic peoples who left their megalithic tombs in the hills around the city understood before everyone, was that this place was not valuable because of what humans had built here. It was valuable because of where it was. The Tagus estuary, the Atlantic harbor, the 7 hills overlooking the junction of river and ocean. These were the permanent facts, the geological gifts that no political decision could create or destroy. Every civilization that passed through Lisbon found the same thing, a location so strategically and economically perfect that ignoring it was simply not an option. The Phoenicians could not ignore it. Carthage could not ignore it. Rome could not ignore it. And Julius Caesar, standing on those hills in 61 BCE, looking west at the ocean that terrified his soldiers, and east at the road that led back to Rome and everything he wanted to become, understood that the city on the edge of the world was not a footnote in Roman history. It was a foundation. It was Felicitas Julia. It was fortunate. It was blessed. And it would outlast everything, including him.